Welcome to the Cattedra Antonio Rosmini. In these 4 video lectures, I will analyze the economical thought of Antonio Rosmini and try to characterize it pertaining to the liberal tradition. Now, the liberal tradition itself is not a monolithic system, but it contains a variety of conceptions and traditions which often are quite incommensurable the one with the others. In order to define better the Rosminian economical thought, I will analyze, therefore, the distinction between liberalism, libertarianism, and ordoliberalism. This distinction is not a complete list of the various liberal thoughts, but a methodology which enables to characterize more closely a certain liberal thought. Libertarianism and ordoliberalism can be understood as 2 attempts to renew liberalism in significant moments of its crisis. Ordoliberalism in order to face the challenge of totalitarianism, and libertarianism in order to counter the egalitarian risk of the social democratic interpretation of liberalism in the post-war welfare states. A deeper analysis of Rosmini's thought will show, indeed, many affinities to the ordoliberal model, which is the theoretical basis of what was called social market economy. The adjective social in this expression does not have a collective meaning, but indicates an ontological dimension of the concept of liberty itself. Therefore, also the expression social market economy is a liberal model and is based on the idea of free market. The similarities of Rosmini's conception to this model would indicate a way how Rosmini can give us today some benchmarks to face the crisis, which first of all is social and cultural crisis. Another tentative to actualize Rosmini in an analogous way was presented by Carlos Hövel in his volume The Economy of Recognition, Person, Market and Society in Antonio Rosmini. Hövel reads Rosmini as a new actualization of civil economy, as it was conceived by the thinkers of Napolitanian Enlightenment around Antonio Genovesi, such Galliani, Doria, Giannone, Vico, Filangieri first of all, Pagano, Bianchini and others. This tradition was read by Hövel in critical distance to the principles of Adam Smith. Today, Stefano Zamagni and Luigino Bruni have reformulated this idea as a critical alternative to capitalism. Now, the result of our analysis will be that we disagree with this thesis of Hövel, poor appreciating very much this deep study of Hövel and his inputs which he gave and which he is still giving to the research of the economical thought of Antonio Rosmini. But through this appreciation of Rosmini, of Hövel, and we are also good friends, I have a great esteem in his confront, but I would like to enter in a deeper discussion, which is also a critique of some fundamental theses of this book. And we will show that there are much more reasons to retain that Rosmini would be a prophet of ordoliberalism and of social market economy than not an exponent of the tradition of civil economy. In order to demonstrate the affinities of Rosmini to ordoliberalism and social market economy, we criticize in a first step in this video lecture the thesis of Carlos Hövel. Then, in the next lecture, we will analyze the various theoretical conceptions of liberalism, libertarianism and ordoliberalism to enlighten in the end in the third and fourth video lecture some central elements of the economical thought of Antonio Rosmini, showing his correspondence to ordoliberalism. According to Carlos Hövel, Rosmini's economic thought is a sound criticism of the subjectivist and utilitarian conception of the economic science, aiming at refuting this science in a personalistic approach. This is what Carlos Hövel literally writes. With this expression, personalistic approach, Hövel identifies the moral foundation of economics in human action. This thinking, according to the reading to Hövel, is not anti-liberal. He expressly writes that his attempt is not to show Rosmini like an anti-liberal thinker, but a specific expression of liberalism which avoids the liberal trap, consisting in the exclusion of any moral and reciprocal dimension of the economic actions, because reducing it to the only aim of pleasures. If this would be a right and pertinent definition of liberalism, we could not but agree with Hövel to find in Rosmini a radical alternative to liberalism. But unfortunately, Hövel does not collocate these differences as possible variations of the liberal tradition, but searches for a liberal concept which would be alternative to liberalism, finding it in the civil economy approach of Zamagni and Bruni, which has its own enlightened roots, as we have seen in the Napolitanian tradition, but it's stressed against individualism and capitalism, and therefore in the actual crisis does not aim to renew the economy of free market, but to find an alternative. Instead, to the maximization of individual profit, economy should be based on the moral attitude of reciprocity and gratuity in a corporate context. Now, in the use of this word, expression liberalism, we can see that various thinkers and various authors do indeed understand with this word very, very different meanings. Hövel searches for a new form of liberalism, but inserting this idea in the tradition of Napolitanian Enlightenment, which is actualization in the civil economy approach of Zamagni and Bruni, he affirms a liberalism which is against and which is contrarious to the very liberal principles of the tradition which is beginning from Adam Smith and which has taken in the past centuries another ways of ideas. And so this liberal alternative to liberalism is like a joke with the word liberalism. It's a joke with the word liberalism because they search for a radical alternative to that what actual thinkers would define a new foundation of liberalism, what libertarianism or ordoliberals would define some new forms of liberalism. This approach, this civil economy approach, insists to be liberal because it overcomes the dichotomy between individual and the state, and therefore it is critical to a state control of economy. This indeed is perhaps one of the most important and one of the few elements for which this approach can also be defined in a certain way liberal. Zamagni indeed rightly insists very much on this point. But anyway, we deal with a radical alternative to the other liberal tradition beginning with Adam Smith, insofar the civil economy aims to overcome methodological individualism. Now, it is also clear why for Hövel personalism means an alternative to classical liberalism and to capitalism, because the concept of person here is used as a critical and moral contraposition to the criterion of individuality. As for example, for the encyclical Centesimus Annus, personalism is not necessarily a contraposition to capitalism. For Hegel, for example, it is, because he has an extreme moral reading of the concept of personalism. Why in the Centesimus Annus we find a very social ethic reading of this concept, stressing more on the basis of the principle of liberty than not of a moral deduction or of a directly moral justification of the concepts of the laws which rule indeed the market. This personalism finds its expression in Hegel's interpretation of Rosmini's economical thought in showing a certain moral balance of Rosmini's reasoning. Without any doubt, Rosmini's thought presents this balance in terms which today we would call human capital, and for Rosmini consisted in the well-adjusted maximization of knowledge, will and power. Hegel is right when he affirms the central problem of the economy is not just technical or political. It is a problem of internal phenomenological and ethical balance of the economic agents. But this balance determines methodologically the whole interpretation of Hegel and gives to it a certain moralistic character. In my opinion, Rosmini distinguishes more precisely between moral arguments and social ethic reasoning on the institutions of free market. This is particularly important in his definition of ownership, which is the fundament of the derivation of right. Here Rosmini affirms clearly, and in this quotation taken from the philosophy of right of Rosmini, I think we can see very clearly the difference between the social ethic argumentation of the philosophy of right and strictly moral argumentation, which, for example, we can find in the principles of morals in Rosmini. Rosmini affirms clearly, jural freedom means only that relationship of governance that an owner has towards what he owns, enabling him morally to use it as he wishes. It could happen that some kind of morally obligatory law impedes or limits the use that a person can make of something that is his own. In this case, the law would limit not only the jural freedom of the person, but even his right of ownership. His ownership of what is proper would be reduced to the extent that the obligatory law prevented him from using it as he wishes. As we can see, the idea of ownership essentially embraces and embodies that of freedom of free use. Ownership, therefore, is normally defined as the faculty of disposing as one pleases, without interference from others, to the substance of a thing and of what is useful in it. We clearly deal in Rosmini's conception of right with an order of creating and guaranteeing liberty and free development of personhood, not with a moral order of prohibition. This is very clear, I think, in this quotation. Rosmini clearly affirms, and this is another quotation, we place the supreme principle of rights in person, in personal freedom. Right is a faculty of free activity. Personal freedom, therefore, must be the formal principle of ownership. So, this strict combination between personal freedom and personal ownership, this is, we can say, the central principle of right in Rosmini. And this is the level of social ethic argumentation, which is not separated, which is in a strong relationship with moral principles, but it is not identical with it. Now, just to give some examples for Hegel's interpretation. On the one hand, Hövel finds in Rosmini's text a clear critique of consumerism, luxury and fashion, but on the other hand also the value of meaningful spending in itself, which is more worthy than saving and deserves to be encouraged as long as it increases in the person's merit, and even luxury, if it does not serve egoism but the nation's greatness, is admitted. This is an example for the moral balance, which is the argument of Hövel. Rosmini says, what can we say about consumerism? There is a critique of consumerism. We have not too much to incentive consumerism, but a certain way, a certain moral consumerism is clearly legitimated. Then, to make another example, Hövel sees in Rosmini the critique of a false understanding of incentives. However, incentives are moral when they guide the active citizens and strengthen the passive ones. Further, another example, competition is considered in its ambiguity because it could lead to destruction, while at the same time it guarantees freedom. Then, another example, arguing against Locke that labor is not motivated only by pain, Rosmini affirms, on the one hand, that no one can be forced by government to work, but only by moral reasoning. For example, on the evil or on one's laziness. However, on the other hand, he holds that government can require work from those who receive social assistance. Again, on the topic of work, while Rosmini recognizes the right to work, he affirms at the same time its flexibility and the impossibility of a durative full employment. Ultimately, to make a last example, government has to assist the extremely necessary cases and to take care for the fundamental capacities, but without substituting the individual's beneficiary. All these examples for the idea of moral balance, which is the real and the central methodologic interpretive principle which with her reads the Rosmini's philosophy of right. All these affirmations which we found in Hövel's book and which he put together in these sort of antitheses show that the architecture of his work is constructed on the aim to present the moral middle, which is the virtue of the institution of economy. And without any doubt, we treat with the ideal result of a just configuration of the economic system. But in this way, these arguments are not able to give a sort of foundation of concrete institutions. I don't say that this reading is false. Indeed, Hövel took all these examples clearly from the philosophy of right of Rosmini. But in this way, Hövel showed only the moral side of Rosmini's argumentation. I think that this moral side, this moral middle, this virtue of institutions, as also Rawls would say, for Rosmini is more of all a sort of teleology of an end, of the aim to what result economy should lead. But Rosmini has also the question, which will be the central question then for ordoliberalism, how do we have to characterize, to impose, to create social institutions, economical institutions, to produce on the basis of the liberty of every economic and individual agent these good aims, these good ends, this good result. The fundamental achievement of Rawls and of post-Rawlsian libertarianism is indeed the foundation of the institutions of free market. And I think that Rosmini anticipates very clearly this necessity to a deeper foundation of the liberal aspects of the institutions of market, as we have in libertarianism, as we have in ordoliberalism and so on. And this foundation is based on the concept of liberty. The same aim has already moved the thinkers of ordoliberalism and social market economy, which in the Anglo-Saxon discussion were indeed not noticed. In Rosmini now we can find this interest to justify social institutions on the basis of the concept of liberty and not directly on the moral imperative. Very closely to Kant, even if Kant is very criticized in Rosmini's philosophy of right for other reasons, Rosmini elaborates a philosophical discourse which finds in the cognitive concept of liberty the foundation of social institutions and not directly in the moral discourse. And as well as in Kant, this discourse is distinguished but not completely separated from the moral imperative, because this moral imperative is the ratio cognoscendi of liberty. We must note carefully that the duty of respecting moral freedom, this is a quotation of Rosmini, we must note carefully that the duty of respecting moral freedom in others does not depend upon this faculty's being a right, but on its being a right because others have the duty to respect it. This dimension of recognition of respectation of the liberty of others is the fundament of social ethical reasoning. This moral freedom of some given activity in a person and the moral duty of others to respect that activity arise from different sources. The first can certainly exist without the second, and the second without the first. The moral source can exist without the juridical respectation and vice versa. Therefore, as well as in Kant, also in Rosmini, the imperative to recognize all the beings in their order and therefore to recognize the dignity of human person stands evidently in a close relationship to the foundation of liberal institutions. Because the recognition of personhood of others and therefore of their original liberty is the essence of right. This recognition, according to Rosmini, is the moral fundament of right, and since it is a recognition, it has also a cognitive basis. As we will see further on in this video lecture, the recognition as the basis, as the moral basis of right, for Rosmini is not only cognitive. This will be the critics on Hegel, for example, but it is also cognitive. It is not reductive on a non-cognitivism as we find, for example, in some authors of the liberal tradition beginning with Adam Smith. This is the autonomous methodological fundament of the philosophy of right and of Rosmini's liberalism, this distinction between moral duty and juridical duty. In the system of rights, the recognition of others is de jure realized and should also be de facto realized. So we deal with a type of ethical life through institutions in the Hegelian sense. We cannot translate the Hegelian Sittlichkeit with morality because the sense of Hegel's practical philosophy lies in the distinction between Sittlichkeit, which in English is usually translated with ethical life, and Moralität, morality. So liberty has its proper order, which, and here Rosmini is more Kantian than Hegelian, does not overcome morality negating it, but in a certain way becomes its social form, and as its social form also its social possibility. Therefore, not only morality as morality of liberty is the fundament of the system of rights, but this morality of liberty is translated into the essence of rights as the most original realization of this liberty. In this way, the essence of rights becomes in a certain way the metaphysical and social presupposition for the realization of morality. It's ratio essendi. Therefore, Rosmini can say that the discovery of the person, that is, of the principle of liberty, was the turning point of social systems because it was the presupposition that liberty could be realized also through the social structures which are, and in the measure in which they are, juridical structures. Another quotation from Rosmini: we placed the supreme principle of rights in person, in personal freedom. When we investigated the principle of derivation and determination of rights, however, was turned to the concept of ownership. The fundamental rights for Rosmini grow up from a concrete metaphysics of liberty, which means the personalization of the world of things and of social relationships. The personalization of the world of things and of social relationships. This means, as we will see further on in this video lecture, not a socialization of the principle of person, but it means that the whole reality is interpreted beginning with the principle of person. And this principle of person in this way is, without any doubt, in a certain way individualistic. Individualistic in the sense that for Rosmini it is an uncommunicable principle. The unicity of person. There stands the basis of recognition of dual duties and of the system, of the social system of liberty, which is then the basis for the economical thought of Rosmini. In the first manner, in the manner of the personalization of the world of things, we have the first book of the philosophy of right of Rosmini. Here Rosmini personalizes fundamentally the concept of property. And in the second manner, the personalization of social relationships, which is centrally to the second book of the philosophy of right, Rosmini personalizes the intersubjective dimension through the universal society of mankind. Against Kant, Rosmini does not speak of abstract ownership and abstract universality of mankind, but declines these dimensions as dimensions of relationship. This interpersonal dimension can be in a certain way interpreted as Hegelian, also if at the same moment it is very critical to Hegel. But this relationship is not individual. It does not exclude liberty in the moral imperative, but it is social. And that means that it is a relationship based on the recognition of liberty. Rosmini distinguishes the difference with the terms morality and essence of right. The basis of rights not follow the imperative, but to recognize the liberty of the other person, which for Rosmini is the consequence of this imperative. The conduct is not determined by the individual moral duty, but by the liberty of others. To distinguish this dimension, Rosmini speaks not about moral, but of juridical recognition. Juridical recognition is a specific form of recognition based on moral recognition, but distinguished from it. It should be clear now that the social institutions, in a liberal and Rosminian sense, are institutions of liberty, a social realization of morality, which is not the same as the morality of individual actions. We cannot reduce, in the liberal sense, the first one to the latter one. The main problem of the civil economy approach is not that it criticizes the individualistic dimension of liberal economy, but that it reduces this important difference between the ethics of institutions based on the cognitive principle of liberty and the individual ethics of moral actions. Besides the many advantages of the principle of personhood, this is a real problem. It tends to blur the difference. Civil economy tends to blur this difference. Perhaps, but for every liberal approach, for every thought which should be a liberal thought, this difference, as now we have considered, is very important. Perhaps for this reason, the liberal tradition often criticizes this concept and prefers to speak of abstract individuality, which consents better to analyze the logic of liberal institutions than not the moral perspective. For this reason, to save the difference, often the methodological individualism is stressed against a rhetoric of personalism, which, in the way in which Hegel and the civil economy tradition uses the word personalism, often tends to blur this difference. Now, the two basic principles of Rosmini's philosophy of right, individual and social right, do not only give the structure to Hegel's book, but they are also able to show in what the moral misunderstanding of Rosmini consists. On the one hand, for Hegel, the emblematical key element of Rosmini's comprehension of economics and social order is the concept of ownership, which is presented as a moral variation of a liberal approach without individualistic reductionism. Indeed, it is elaborated in the 7th chapter with the title Recognizing the Other. Rosmini rejects both the Anglo-Saxon argumentation of ownership by labor and its continental foundation by civil society, and presents his personalistic concept in the perspective of Trinitarian ontology, which comprehends the whole being of person in a physical, intellectual, and moral manner. All three dimensions are considered in the dimension of property. And Rosmini says, we do not limit the meaning of the word ownership to dominion over external things. We take it in its original natural significance, which involves all that the person has joined to himself as part of himself, that is, as his. In this meaning, as we said, the word ownership is highly appropriate in indicating the characteristic differentiating the existing of rights and jural duties. Accordingly, ownership constitutes a sphere around the person in which the person is the center. No one else can enter this sphere. End of quotation. The process of appropriation is considered in the following way. Next quotation. Rosmini says, this extraordinary fact of human nature, called ownership, consists in the inclination and the power possessed by the human person for uniting to himself, with all the forces at his disposition, whatever he considers as good. The person immediately thinks of these things as parts of himself, as his own. This act is called appropriation. The characteristics of ownership for Rosmini are four: exclusiveness, perpetuity, unity, simplicity. Unity and simplicity is one, and in the end, unlimitedness. All these characteristics are derived from the spiritual nature of the person. Since the person is ontologically structured in the triple manner of intellectual, real, and moral dimension, also Rosmini's concept of property resembles this dimension. And Rosmini says, this juncture between things and persons must be threefold: physical, intellectual, and moral. The physical juncture arises from two things: from a real relationship of utility between something and a person, and from taking possession of the thing. This is the real element. Then the intellectual juncture also arises from two things: from act of intelligence, with which the thing is mentally conceived and conceived as good for oneself. This gives rise of the thought of taking possession and making use of the thing. and secondly, from another intellective act, which we judge that the thing, when knows as free, may lawfully be taken possession of without our injuring the ownership of anybody else. Finally, the moral juncture arises from two things: from the act of will, which the person intends to take stable, with which the person intends to take stable possession of the thing and retains it exclusively for its own use, and secondly, from the dual quality inherent to this act, in which the formal appropriation of the thing consists. This dual quality is established through the things becoming part of the feeling of myself, in such a way that touching it means touching me, as we can see from the pain we feel and the injury we receive when it is touched. End of quotation. All ownership has to reflect, therefore, this triple ontological dimension. And here we see the relationship between person and property, and between person and ownership, where the three dimensions are founding the dimension of the person. Also, the moral dimension of property is not the interpersonal moral dimension, but it regards, it is formulated to determine and to define always the relationship between the person and the thing. All ownership has to reflect this triple dimension. In this sense, property becomes the basis of the concept of economic freedom and of the order of freedom rights. In the sphere of economic freedom, as a relative acquired right, personal freedom can be realized. But the moral dimension, which allows to the factual ownership to become a personal right, is not the moral rightness of the owner, but the recognition of the others who have to recognize this ownership independently of the use that the owner makes. Then, in the second part of the book, the theme of social recognition is declined in a classical virtue approach, as always in the analysis of Hövel. Not in the sense of the modern rights approach. As we have seen in the first part of the book, here Hövel declines also property and all the individual dimensions immediately in the dimension of recognizing the others, but not in the very theoretical relationship between the person and the thing. Now also in the second part we have a very moral interpretation of the social institutions of the three societies, reconducting them to a virtual approach and not declining them very much in a modern rights approach. Hövel, according to Rosmini, sees social justice as society's architectonic principle, in the same fashion as all those of the classical period, from Plato and Aristotle onwards, had used it. This is what Hövel writes. I would fundamentally disagree with this affirmation, because for the classical period, social justice, which is a modern word, is based on the moral interpretation of social relationship. But according to Rosmini's idea of recognition as fundamental principle of rights, they are based on the recognition of the other's liberty and individuality. Person is a supreme incommunicable principle, and not on the moral reciprocity of gratuity. The bond of society for Rosmini is constituted only on the basis of the combination of rights, and not directly on a relationship which makes the individuum debtor of the other. This is the moral dimension which is not excluded, but which cannot determine the dimension of rights. This moral interpretation of societies could be true for the theocratic and for the domestic society, but securely not for the civil society. Every society for Rosmini is constituted on the basis of the conjunction of rights. Therefore, Rosmini is skeptical to the notion of common good when he notices that civil society can threaten individual freedom under the pretext of its own advantage and the increase in common good, which cannot be promoted if it harms anyone. For these general motives, I recognize more common principles between Rosmini and the neoliberalism of the German ordoliberalism or of the social market economy than not with civil economy. For example, considering the principle of incentive interventions of the government, which does not harm the individual rights, and also the principle of universal free concurrence, which is very important in the philosophy of right of Rosmini, and which means that Rosmini opts for equality of opportunities with regard to human capacities and not to material equality as result. And for many other reasons, which we will analyze in the next 3 video lectures. Thank you for your attention.